All right, good to see everybody out this morning. Art said it's Mother's Day, so happy Mom's Day to all the mamas and grandmamas and even aunts and all the ladies of influence in our life. We appreciate you very, very much. Today we are still in Hebrews chapter 11, and I didn't transfer the notes, but this still on the top of that rack in the back. If you're needing a copy of the notes, there's still just a handful of chapter 11 notes. The question we're on is a generic question about let's discuss the examples of faith in the chapter. So if you're needing a copy of that, it's not as necessarily as important as what we're going to talk about since we've covered the bulk of that. But there are some on the top of that little tri-shelf rack on the top. I think I transferred those on Wednesday evening, I believe. Let's be turning to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Joel and I were talking last evening, and we were talking about how great this chapter is. And we were talking about how far we're going to make it today. And I said, probably verse 7. That's probably about where we'll make it today. The more I dug into this verse, the more the more came out of it, and there's so much information in chapter 7, or verse 7. I think that's probably where we'll be today, is just in verse 7 about Noah, because he's such a powerful argument to the people that the writer is writing to. The argument is profound, and so what we'll do, we're going to go through the verse. And then we're going to go back and notice about 3 or 4 points that the writer's making to the readers to try to help their faith. And if they understood it properly, which I'm sure they would have, then they could take and apply this to their current situation, and it would be a profound argument to help them out of their discouragement. So we'll probably be just in verse 7 today. I don't know that we'll make it beyond that because there's just too much to talk about in verse 7. Real quick, in chapter 11, just to make sure we maintain context, this is not an isolated chapter where we are not sort of talking about the continued theme of Hebrews. It's just a bunch of illustrations of the last argument the writer made, which back in chapter 10 was to continue to be faithful. Don't give up. Christians aren't quitters. We're not the kind of people who just quit when the going gets tough. And that really is verses 26 through verse 39 of chapter 10. And then we saw in our introduction to this chapter, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where he said, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And these people written about in chapter 11 are the cloud of witnesses that we're supposed to have our attention drawn to help us not be so discouraged to the point that we would quit, right? Everybody gets down, and we all have discouraging moments in our life, but never to quit, never to get to that point. And chapter 11 is supposed to help us about that. Now, last week we discussed verse 1, how it does provide some information about faith, but it's not the all-inclusive definition of faith. And this chapter is more about faithfulness, the effect of faith, more than it is an exploration of the technical definition of faith. Although we did see that faith is the foundation or the substructure of what we hope for, and of course it is the evidence of things not seen. And we talked about a number of things through verse 6 last week, even looking at Abel and how Abel offered a more or better sacrifice than Cain. All right, so let's read verse 7. And then I just want to go bit by bit and sort of really dig into verse 7. There's a lot of information here, and then make some practical points. Verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. All right, so I believe, and I think this is correct, I think what we now have in verse 7 is an illustration of what he just affirmed in verse 6. Now listen to verse 6. Without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. And we were talking about that last week. Faith is not simply the mere mental acknowledgement that God is real. What else goes along with that? What does faith involve? Action. All right, so faith involves action. And what is it that we trust in faith? But God's what specifically? His ability to do what he said he will do. And now in verse 7, we're going to have an illustration of that very thing, that Noah not only believed that God is, but that God could reward those who diligently seek him. And verse 7 is sort of this expanded illustration of that very point, that God is able to do what he says he would do. And it's super important with Noah because Noah's going to have to believe in something that God said he could do that Noah had never seen before. And so they're going to see that in verse 7. Now, just as an aside, faith is not blind trust in impossible things, but faith is trust in God's ability to do what we cannot see. It is our faith or trust in his ability to do something that we may not understand. And I think that's going to be the next illustration because, you get to verse 8, and then all of a sudden now you've got Abraham. And we can put ourselves in his shoes, right? He comes in and tells Sarah, and she goes, we're leaving. We're going someplace. Where are we going? I don't know. How long are we going to stay there? Have no idea. And, you see this faith that God is able to provide a land he's never seen before. So it's what we can't see. Faith is trusting God's ability to do what we can't understand, or maybe something that we have not experienced to this point, but we have the evidence to believe that whatever God said, it's real, it's true, and so we trust God to do that. So our attention is drawn to Noah's trust in the promise of what? What is God promising that Noah had never seen before in verse 7? He had never seen rain before. And remember back in verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of what? Things not seen. And Noah had never seen rain before. Not just Noah. How many people in the world had never seen rain? No one had ever seen rain before.
Another thought that occurred to me, there were other people who received God's word back then.
Yeah.
They just didn't listen to it. But Noah heard God's word and listened.
Yes, he did.
As well as believed and had faith. Of all the people in the world,
Yep.
that somebody else would have listened.
Yeah, and we're going to look at that in a moment. It's an amazing thing. Out of all the people in the world, there were only 8 people who were doing the right thing at that time. Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. I want to talk about something that's sort of the background of this statement. Genesis chapter 1, and then we'll work our way into the story of Noah. One of the reasons this is such a good verse, not just for the readers, but also for us, is that it requires us to believe something about the conditions of the pre-flood world. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with anybody before and you said, before the flood it never rained. I've had people laugh in my face over that argument. They said, that's so stupid. It's always rained. But the truth is it's not always been the case. There was a time when it never actually rained on the earth. Now, the beginning of that is right here in the account of creation, chapter 1. Look at verse 6. Then God said, let there be a firmament. Okay, so I'm reading New King James. It has the word firmament here. In the midst of the waters, let it divide the waters from the waters. And so God made a firmament. He divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Does anybody have a marginal or alternate translation for firmament? Anybody got something different? Okay, expanse. Expanse is probably better. What is the expanse? Okay, so if it's between whatever's on the surface or under the surface of the earth and whatever is above it, then what do we normally call the expanse? It's our atmosphere, right? So between between these bodies of water is our atmosphere, which means there is water above the atmosphere and water below it. All right, so he talks about the division of these waters. There was water above and water below. And so in some way, prior to the flood, there was our atmosphere that was surrounded on both sides by water. Now, I don't know that we could specifically, visually, it's changed. It's not for us to look at today through a microscope and say, see, the world is still like this, because obviously something changed. But if you go to chapter 7, Genesis chapter 7, and I know we're cutting into the story of Noah. We're gonna backtrack in just a second, get some more about Noah. But look at chapter 7. Drop down with me to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, which, by the way, that's significant. In the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains, and let's notice where they are. The fountains, and where are these fountains? Okay, would that suggest above or below? These are below. So somewhere below us were fountains of the great deep. And then what else is opened? The windows of heaven, which is where? Above us. So there was massive amounts of water below and massive amounts of water above in the pre-flood world. Now, if you go back to chapter 2, let's go back to chapter 2. And start with me in verse 1. All right, so creation is finished, and we get a glimpse of what life was like in the garden before God comes along and then comments about the creation of the man and the woman, the tending of the garden. So look at verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. All the host of them were finished. On the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and rested on the seventh day from all its work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day. He sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the heaven, or the earth and the heavens. Now watch verse 5. Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for God had not caused it to rain on the earth. There was no rain, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now we can understand where the water came from, because apparently there were fountains of the great deep, and from those fountains God caused a mist to come up and water the earth. And I know it's not parallel, but every time I read this verse, if you are the person who does, and I thought this was the coolest thing when I was a kid, I still like to see it, when you go into the grocery store and you walk through the produce section and they make that little sound in the produce section, they go, and then the mist goes, and waters all of the greens that are against the wall. That's how I perceive this. There's a mist coming up from the ground, brought about by the subterranean water chambers. So there was something unique about the way it was constructed in the pre-flood world. Gene? Right? So we have the evidence of that pre-flood subterranean water, which is a really unique thing. Now, I don't know that with specificity we could say, again, this is what it looked like, and we know with specifics because it's changed. We don't have the physical evidence to be able to go back and examine it. But before the flood, there was water below and water above, and we have Genesis 7:11 telling us that there were fountains of the great deep, and then there were the windows of heaven where massive amounts of water were stored. Now, what would be the effect of that, perhaps? Think about the pre-flood world. Is there anything in the pre-flood world that was unique that's not unique now? Did people live a lot longer before the flood than they do now? Could that have been assisted by some sort of effect from these waters above and below? And I've heard people say this. I guess it's an apt description, but but people have described this as something like a greenhouse that was in the pre-flood world, where vegetation was lush and perfect, and it was just. And I don't know that we know how to explain it with specifics, but it seems to make sense because of some of the evidences of the pre-flood world.
Well, when you look at that whole situation, that what some people refer to as a canopy, it's saying, especially if you read the book Genesis Flood,
Mm-hmm.
it talks about barometric pressure.
Right.
If you go back and study the barometric chamber, the pressure in the barometric chamber is greater, and it was used for healing. So if you had that on the earth, the pressure was greater on the earth at that time than after the flood.
Yeah.
So that in turn would be one reason for life to be shorter. But that Genesis flood is a good book to learn about what all went on in the flood scientifically.
Yeah, that's right. That's Morris's book, I believe, isn't it? Henry Morris, I think, is it.
Yeah, well, I know it's Morris. I was trying to think if there's anybody, he had a co-author.
Yeah, he might have. But I think he largely got credit for that. Yeah, Gene?
Water is one of the best shield against radiation known to humanity.
Yep.
And so we had a canopy of water above us. It would have shielded us from all kinds of radiation.
Sure.
And it would have changed only 14 days.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And imagine, of course, it would be easy to just chase some rabbits and talk about this because it's super fascinating. Imagine, Gene mentioned, there's a cleaving open of that. The Bible even talks about the breaking open of the fountains of the deep. Imagine that now the layer that would protect it from coming up is broken, and the weight of however deep the layer of the earth was on top of it, it starts to come down. What happens to the water? Where does it go? Supersonically upward. And as it hits the atmosphere, what happens to it? When it gets super, super cold, what happens to water? Freezes and comes down. And people talk about an ice age. Well, I know where the ice came from, right? When water goes up supersonically. And when you're collecting things from the surface of the earth and you're positing that in frozen sections on Mount Everest and other places, people wonder, how did fish fossils get on top of Mount Everest? Well, I know how they got there, because the Bible talks about it. It was a catastrophic event. But imagine that you lived in this pre-flood world, and God comes to you and now says, I'm going to make rain come from the sky. If you're not a person of great faith, what's your response? Yeah, right. Water come from the sky. I mean, we all know water comes from the ground. It's a mist from the ground. So there's a huge issue of faith involved in Noah's response to God, because it had never rained before on the earth. Now, there's an enormity that's involved in this, right? Go back to Genesis chapter 6. It's not just God simply telling Noah, hey, I'm going to make it rain. He actually has him respond to something that he had never seen before. So look at chapter 6 beginning in verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Now, what's that tell us in relation to Hebrews chapter 11? If God tells him something, what's Noah's typical response to that? That's true, I'm going to do it. I'm going to obey it. So Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was also corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. God looks upon the earth. Indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So watch what happens, verse 13 rather. God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. The earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, cover it on the inside and the outside with pitch. It's like a tarry cement type substance. This is how you'll make it. The length of it will be 300 cubits, width of it 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. You make a window for the ark, you'll finish it a cubit from above. You'll set the door in the ark and its side. You'll make it with lower, second, and third decks. And then again, verse 17, I'm going to destroy everything that's on the earth, and then I'll establish my covenant with you. And all of this, making and building and preparing over something that Noah had never seen before, that the world would not believe could happen because it was not something typical. They had never seen it before. So in this, God talks about how he's going to destroy the flood. Noah's going to build the ark and save his family and the animal kingdom from water coming out of the sky which you'd never seen before. And in order to act upon that, what has to be present? Faith has to be present. You've got to believe in things not yet seen, which is why he's such a powerful illustration to the readers. Yeah. Yeah, and obviously there, some bodies of water existed in that time, but if all you'd ever seen is a little mist coming out of the ground, and you now tell people, I'm building an ark to escape water, they're going to go, that's really silly, because the bottom of it may get wet from mist, but it's not enough water to lift it off. It's great faith in that. Ken? Monstrous, yeah. Yes. And what do you think the response of the world was to Noah's building of that ark? Yeah. You get a sense of it. There's no direct statement to this, but you get a sense if you can combine Luke 17, I think it's verse 27, and then you read some from 2 Peter chapter 3. He was a righteous preacher, and it talks about him preaching. But the state of the world was they became even more corrupt. It's like they defied what he was saying. You can imagine the mockery that he received for making this huge flotation device for something no one had ever seen before. Tom? Well, yeah, God gave him plans. And of course, he must, a very ingenious fellow in his own right. We don't discount the incredible intelligence of people who lived during that time, but he had instructions from God, and then his own ingenuity and skill with God's direction ended up in an amazing work of art. Go ahead. Yes. Yes. And my understanding is that ratio, while the dimensions may change, the ratio is still the same for super ships today. They still use that same ratio for balance on the water today, just depending on the size of the ship. All right, so now we have the scenario where in verse 7, God's saying, okay, Noah was divinely moved about a warning of rain, and he had never seen that before. That's huge to what the readers are experiencing. Now, go back to Hebrews. I'm gonna mark Genesis 6. We're going to come back. We've got a lot to look at there, but go back to Hebrews chapter 11. All right, so let's add to it now. Let's add to it. Noah was divinely warned of things not yet seen, and to act on things not yet seen, according to verse 1. It takes faith to do that. All right, so verse 7, how was he moved? With godly fear. What is godly fear? Okay, respect, reverence. He was moved with adoration for God. Literally, the word means to stand in awe. And we're going to make some application in a minute, but we can already see how great must faith be when God said, I'm going to do this, and you've never seen it before, but you stand in awe of what God said he's going to do. It's amazing what he does on this. So Noah was in awe of what God said he would do or could do. And by doing this, the result was, who did he save? He saved his family, right? 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 21, it'll say whereby 8 souls were saved by water or through water. So Noah saved his family. He put them on the ark, and they were divided away from the world of corruption, and he saved his family. And 2 results came from that. One is he condemned the world. You see it right there in verse 7. It says, by which he condemned the world. Now, what does that mean? How did Noah personally condemn the world? Okay, so his action toward God explains why the rest of the people were lost. That's the idea here, is that his response in faith shows why everyone else would be lost, because they were not responding in faith. And he became an heir, or the heir of righteousness which is by or according to faith, meaning he became a recipient of the blessings of righteousness. All right, so here's what we want to do now. Why is this so important to the readers? All right, because we can't lose this. This is what Joe and I were talking about last night. Everything the writer is doing is directly aimed at the situation of the readers. So why would Noah's example be such a powerful example to them? What would it mean to them? Bobby?
They're living in a world where they're in the minority. They're telling people
Okay.
Jesus' name, nobody's believing it. They're preaching just like Noah did and having no effect. So they just got to look at the bigger picture. This is what they're doing.
Exactly. I want to come to that point in just a second. It's a great point. Here's one thing. Steve, go ahead.
I was going to say, you listen to the world today, how the world actually, to the point where they ridicule anyone that believes the story of the Bible.
Yep.
And so it's a comparison between Noah's Ark and the church.
Yes. It's for us to do. It's for us today too. All right, so here's one thing I jotted down in my notes, and I'm going to get to Bobby's point in a second. He's got one of my points, and so we'll come back to that. Here's the first thing. Noah was told to believe in what he had not what? Seen. And the readers are now being asked to believe in what? In what they've not seen. Is this a comparable illustration for them? Is Noah's situation very parallel to their own situation? They're being asked to move on something that they cannot physically see. Stay with me in the book. Look at the book. Go back to chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. This is so powerful. I spent a lot of time this week just connecting the dots in Hebrews because I thought, boy, this inspired statement in verse 7 is so powerful to the readers. Look at chapter 7. Look at verse 27. Speaking of the high priest, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own and then for the people's, for this he did once for all when he offered up himself. So from the reader's perspective, what could they see? What could they see? In Jerusalem, what could they see? They could see priests in Jerusalem offering up sacrifices, and now God's saying, your high priest's not in Jerusalem. They couldn't see him. And they're struggling. I think Joel brought this out last week. They're really struggling between the physical nature of Judaism and the spiritual nature of the priesthood and the church, and they're really struggling. They're sort of caught between the two. And Noah was divinely warned of things not yet seen, and they're struggling to really have the faith in what God is telling them, that there is a priesthood, and your high priest is in heaven, but their focus is on the physical. And so Noah becomes this powerful illustration. In fact, stay in the same text. Look down to chapter 8, verse 1. What's his point? Now, this is the main point of the things we're saying. What is he saying to them? We do what? We have a high priest. Could they see him? Could they walk into Jerusalem in the temple and see him administrating the services to God? They couldn't see that because where's the high priest? He's at the right hand of God in heaven. He can't see that. They're being asked now to believe in things not seen. And Noah was being asked to believe in things not seen. Now, I think this is a very, and Steve was talking about how practical this is for us today. I think this is a very, very practical point for us today. Sometimes when people leave false religion and they see the emotionalism and the physical display of false religion, and they come in the church where worship is about spirit and truth, are they sometimes drawn back to what was physical and what was seen? And we're being asked to believe in things not seen, right? To with faith understand that if we offer in spirit and truth, while it may not have the emotionalism and all the physical pomp and circumstance attached to it, will God be pleased with spirit and truth worship? So we're being asked to believe in that. Right? It's just a powerful illustration. Noah moved with faith. He never seen a drop of rain in his life before, but he moved because he knew God was telling the truth. And we have to do exactly the same thing. So that's the first thing. Here's number 2. How did Noah move toward God? He moved with godly fear. All right, so Noah moved with respect or adoration from God. And if the readers are going to act in faith, what would it require of them? Respect. All right, so it all comes back to respect. Godly fear, is that paralyzing fear and dread and terror of God? No. Now, I want to be very clear. Is it okay to be afraid of damnation? Hell is not a funny, jokey, laughy place. It's scary, right, to think about hell. And the writer in the book of Hebrews has more than established that there's some serious consequences if they keep going the way they're going to go. He talks about how they're drifting in chapter 2, and then you get to chapter 6, and he says, if you've been once enlightened and you've tasted the heavenly gift and you've done all this, it's impossible to renew you to repentance if you keep crucifying the Son of God afresh. That's scary. And then he gets in chapter 10, and he says, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So he's warned them, and there should be fear of that. But if we're going to respond to God in faith, do we respond out of a cowering fear toward God? What moves us to obey God? Respect for God. And Noah moved with respect for God, and the readers were supposed to move with respect to God. And if we're going to act in faith, we have to move out of respect toward God. If we love God, it leads to a faithful trust and obedience of Him, and that's how we need to respond today to God as well. Dread sometimes moves people, but it ought to be godly fear, right? It ought to be godly fear. And I say this because let's make an application to us personally. If you want to get people to attend services or pray more or read the Bible more or evangelize like they're supposed to do, what motive is the one that will do that? Respect. Why would you ever attend services? Because you love God. And why would you ever read His Word? Because you respect Him. And why would you ever pray more to Him? Because you respect Him. That's what moves people to do that. It doesn't mean you can't say, look, there's tragedy if we don't do these things, but it's godly fear that moves us, just like Noah. All right, here's number 3. Number 3. Noah was asked to do something the world could not possibly understand. The world could not understand what Noah was being asked to do. And what about the church in the writer's day? Were they being asked to do things the world could not understand? Are we asked to do things the world can't understand? Yes. I can put myself in those shoes, right? I know how it would be if somebody starts building I'd lived in a day where there's never a drop of rain. He starts building this ginormous object. He said, well, it's going to rain, it's going to pick it up, and we're going to be saved inside. I would think, you are one crazy person. You're a fool for doing this. What a waste of time to do that. An ark, can you imagine the kickback and the opposition and the mockery? Now, according to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3, God gave a timeline. He said, my spirit will not always strive with man, and He gave him a timeline. What was the timeline? 120 years. Now, we're not really sure how much of that time Noah spent building the ark, but it was a long time. And when the scoreboard started at 120 years, how many people in the world were faithful? And at the end of a 120-year period, how many people were faithful? 8. Can you imagine the pressure on a family to bend and amend themselves to the world's ways when the only people in the whole wide world, out of perhaps millions of people who are doing the right thing, are 8 people in the whole world? That's a lot of pressure, isn't it? Do the right thing. By the way, I know sometimes, we say, well, everybody else is doing it. That was the only time in the world when you could say that and not be lying about that. That was true. Everybody else in the world was doing something else. But no one ever agreed with him. And at the end of that, it was only 8 souls. And did Jesus warn His disciples of the same? Yeah, Barry, sorry.
I'm a weird fellow. I think about this weird.
Yeah.
Times that, but you think about the emotional strain.
Oh, every day.
To know that those people
Are lost. Yeah. And to look at them and to know that unless you change, this is your end is, it's set. You're destroyed. Yeah. I know. And that's the way we ought to look at it. When you look outside of the Lord's saved body, these people are lost, and we've got to bring them in. Yeah, I know it. And I don't think sometimes we have that compassion and emotion toward the lost, but we should. Did Jesus warn His disciples that they would be rejected by people who didn't understand what they were doing? Yep. John chapter 3, He said, verse 19, the world loves darkness. They're not going to accept what you're doing. And you get to John 15, he said they didn't receive me, and they're certainly not going to receive you. John 15, beginning in verses 18 through 25. In fact, at the beginning of the Gospel of John, it starts talking about John the Baptist, how he paved the way for the light. That's Jesus, and it's speaking of the light. It said he came to his own, and what did his own not do? They rejected him. They didn't even receive him. So if they're not going to receive Jesus, they're not going to receive us. They're not going to receive the church. So when you think of Christianity, when we're out professing a heavenly citizenship, when now everybody's caught on physical stuff, that seems weird to the world. Or when we tell people that we have a heavenly sanctuary, or that we're a spiritual priesthood, a royal priesthood, or our message, or our worship, or the terms of entrance into the kingdom, those things seem odd to the world. And yet Noah was asked to believe something the world perceived as impossible and silly, and we're asked to do exactly the same thing. Faith is doing what is right with God, not what is deemed right by the world. And Noah understood that. And so, I don't know, this, and to Barry's point about how, we make application to the church, I think there's another. Is there a lot of pressure on churches today to change to fit the standards of the world, to appeal to the world? And did Noah change to fit the standards of the world? No, he stood constant against it. And here's number 4. Number 4, Noah saved himself and his family by doing what God said, and the readers would do exactly the same thing. Noah was told what the end of the disobedient would be. God said it several times that they would be destroyed. I'm going to destroy all flesh from the face of the earth. Genesis 6:17. So here is his choice. If I identify with the world, and God said he's going to destroy the world, what would his end be? I'm destroyed. Or I can be different from the world and be saved and saved my family. And the readers of this book had exactly the same choice. They were being tempted to go back and serve a dead system that was really popular in their community, but if they identified with that, what was their end? I'm destroyed. Or I can be different and save myself and save my family. And the only place to separate from them is within the church. And that's our choice today, right? We have a choice to save our families today. And we could do it. We could pursue popularity, and we could seek after worldliness and applause and success and money and all those things. But remember, Jesus said, what will you give in exchange for your soul? Because if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul, you've not really gained anything, right? And that's what Genesis chapter 11, verse 7 is about. So I'm sorry we didn't make it any further than that. It's just, that's a powerful, powerful, powerful verse. And such a powerful argument to the readers and to us. Any final thoughts on verse 7? And then we'll try to study the life of Abraham from chapter 11 next week. Yep. Yeah. At the end of everything, right, when it's all done and said, what else matters besides saving your family? There's nothing, right? And so we should be willing, we will give up whatever we have to give up. We will stand and be mocked for the rest of our life just to have our family to be saved. And that's all that matters, because I go back to what Barry said. We should all, I want everybody to go to heaven. I can't imagine people being lost. I know they're going to be if they don't obey. But of all the people in the whole wide world that I want in heaven, I want my family there. And whatever ark I have to build to get there, I'm going to do it. And I know you're going to do the same. So that's what verse 7 is about. And these readers, they're literally teetering on giving up on everything. And the writer says to them through verse 7, you better be willing to do whatever you have to do to make it. Save yourself and save your family. That's a powerful verse. All right. What about Abraham? Now, there's more than one example about Abraham. And I even love coming up where he's going to talk about Isaac. And he's telling us Abraham really intended to kill his son. How great faith is that? And we'll figure out what all that meant in next week's lesson. So thank you for your great input today. You've helped me out a lot. Hopefully you have new appreciation for verse 7, and we'll pick up with